Okay, that looks like we've got everything going. Hopefully Zoom is going to do what it's going to do and it's recording. We're going to move forward. Thank you for filling in some time for me. Pennington does so many things for me that are very useful. I'm married way over my head. I don't mind paying her fines. A couple of things, again, welcome. We've talked about the questions. If you're here for the very first time to TBC, not necessarily this class, but if you're here to TBC for the very first time, just go ahead and raise your hand so we can embarrass you. Great, welcome. One of the things, just so that everybody knows, is at the Welcome Center, and all the ushers are doing that, are encouraging people who are at TBC for the very first time looking for a place to plug in. They're sending them to the different Sunday morning classes that we have going on. So we may frequently have new people who have been here for the very first time. So I'm going to welcome people on a regular basis, and then if you see somebody raise their hand, please make sure that you invite them to your small group. We really want to help people get plugged in. So this is kind of one of those introductory ways that people can meet TBC and at the same time then get plugged into a small group. So we are glad you are here at TBC and welcome you. Another thing to keep in mind is if you want to be on the mailing list for this class, Kathy Kimes is the person to talk to. She's not here right now. But if you want to know her email, somebody around here can give you her email and she will put you on the mailing list, and that way you can get, she sends out the link to the YouTube video. She sends out, if you need it, she has the schedule of what we're going to be doing and what we're going to be reading so that you can read ahead, because reading ahead definitely makes the difference. We cover way too much chapter stuff to actually read it verse by verse here. So that's really helpful. Any other announcements that you guys feel need to be made or things that I need to say? Okay, you guys are really quiet today. That's okay. It's July 4th. It's Independence, which means I can independently call on anybody and to get the discussion going. So we're going to continue with our study of Leviticus, and we're going to look at chapters 6 through 10 this week. So you can turn to Leviticus 6 through 10. And to kind of get us ready to go, do you guys remember Mary that we talked about last week? Tell me a little bit about Mary.
She had some illegitimate things going on in her life, and I think drugs and all kinds of unholy living.
So we talked about Mary, and Mary, as I said, Mary's a real person. Her name has been changed. And Mary had a rough kind of upbringing, was, had a lot of sexual deviancy forced upon her, went to college, was recapitulating some of those things, eventually became a believer, was married, had a one-night stand and committed adultery, and now she's just completely broken. Not knowing what she can do, how can she get out of this? She's ready to kind of give up on everything. And we talked about how that the sacrifices in Leviticus really answer her needs for forgiveness. Really help answer guilt and shame and moving forward and starting afresh, so that Leviticus chapters 1 through 6 are intensely practical for someone like Mary. The reason why I want to bring Mary up is because remember the end of the scenario. She's come to you looking for help. So how are you going to help Mary? I'm going to let you stay quiet for a minute, but we're going to actually come back to answer. And here's the point. Leviticus 6 through 10 answer that question. Because what the priests do with the sacrifice is what we do to help someone like Mary. And we all have Marys in our lives. We all have people that have need. And our role in helping them is analogous to what the priests are doing in Leviticus. So again, we're going to see that when we discuss, putting blood on the ear and the thumb and the foot and things that seem to be so totally, okay, what does this have to do with me? We're going to see they're intensely practical because it is through our understanding of what the priests do that we will find ourselves fully equipped to help someone like Mary. So just a quick, again, set down where we are. In order to understand Leviticus, we need to understand the context. And you'll get tired of hearing this. Leviticus is written to a people already in covenant, being redeemed. So the book of Leviticus is not how do you become saved, how do you become a Christian, how do you become Jewish, as it were. It's written to a people who were in the desert, and God's glory has filled the tabernacle after they've left Egypt. So it's a people already in covenant relationship. And last week we talked about the sacrifices. We talked about those things that allow us to have fellowship with a holy God when we are unrighteous. So the sacrifices are a means by which an unholy person, such as me, can have fellowship with a holy God. So now we come to, as I said, the priests. The other thing we realize is that in order to figure out how to apply Leviticus, the first thing we have to do is ask ourselves the question is, how does Jesus fulfill what we are seeing in Leviticus? And last week was pretty easy. We're used to thinking about Jesus in terms of sacrifice. I don't know that this week is going to be very difficult. We're used to talking about Jesus in his role as our high priest. So, surprise, surprise, we're going to see that as we go through Leviticus, these aspects that the priests had to do and that concern the priests are fulfilled in Jesus. And then that final step is once we see how they are fulfilled in Jesus, and we recognize that we are now the body of Jesus, 2021 years later, now we can begin to ask ourselves the question, well then what does that mean for us? What do we need to do to look like Jesus in this area? So we've already talked about Mary. So Genesis, Leviticus chapters 6 through 10 talk about the role and function of priests. And priests are needed as an intermediary between holy God and sinful man. Now, Leviticus is not the only place that God has talked about priests. If you go back to Exodus, and those of you that were here for Rick's Exodus study, one of the things that you'll remember is that there were a significant number of chapters and references to the priests in Exodus. So, for example, who were the priests? The Levites. So the sons of Levi. So there's a particular tribe. Not everybody could be a priest, but only certain people could be a priest as the descendants of Levi. Okay? We're going to learn, where do the priests live? Do they have their own territory? No. The priests do not have their own territory. They live scattered among the various tribes. Exodus also went into great detail about the clothing that a priest can wear and the lineage of the priest. So with that in mind, we now come to Leviticus, where we now get to see the priests in action. And so Leviticus 6 through 10 are the priests in action among a people covenantly redeemed and offering sacrifices. So, let me ask you a question. What does a priest do? You kind of break it down into two major categories. What does a priest do?
Offer
Okay, so they offer sacrifice. Blow that up into a bigger, what is a sacrifice doing? Cleansing for sin. So what does that allow? So, relationship with God. So, one thing a priest does is serve as an intercessor from man to God. A priest represents man to God. So it's the other thing a priest does. Teaches. So another thing the priest does is represent God to man. And if we look at Leviticus 6 through 10, you're going to see it kind of breaks down like that. In chapters, in chapter 6, we really see this. In chapter 6, we see that the priest represents God to man. And as you looked at, what did you guys notice when you read Leviticus chapter 6? What sort of things jumped out? Say what?
Regulations.
There were a number of regulations. And what were these regulations concerning? Do you notice there was a lot of emphasis on something in particular? Not only offerings, but what did you need in order to do the offering? You needed fire. So there's a lot of talk in this of how the priests had to keep the fire burning. That sounds like a country song. Okay, but in chapter 6, you'll notice that they're talking about ash, wood. How do you clean out the ash? You have to go and wear your special, not priestly clothes, but your linen clothes. Why? Because you're carrying ash and you've got to take it out and they need to bring it back. And the fire is never to go out. So they're always to keep wood going. And so you see this picture of the priests constantly keeping the fire going, constantly tending to the altar, so that the fire of God is always present. You'll notice that there's a lot of talk about what the priests are supposed to wear. So in this section, what are the priests supposed to wear? Linen, which makes sense because you're in the desert. Okay, so you're going to wear linen. It's probably going to get wrinkled. That's okay, though, because you're carrying a lot of dust. Later on, what are the priests supposed to wear? More special clothes. Okay?
It gets bloodied all the time.
We're going to come to that, Pat, and hold off on that. That's bothered her all week. Blood on the clothing. What are we going to do with it? So when you look at Leviticus 6, 8 through 13, one of the things you notice is that the priest is constantly providing access to the Lord. There's this emphasis that God does not go away. God is always present. You always have access. How do we know? Because the priests are always available, night and day. The fire is going night and day. There's a huge emphasis on that. In chapter 6, verses 14 through 23, it talks about the sacrifices and how they are consumed. And again, we've already talked about the sacrifices. Now we're looking at it from the priest's perspective. And what did we say it meant when the phrase, an aroma pleasing to the Lord? What does that tell us?
They're sacrificing.
That they are sacrificing and that it was acceptable. So one of the things that the priest has to continually do is assure the people of the Lord's acceptance. Okay, that, number one, they're providing access to God. They are representing God. Number two, that their sacrifice is accepted, that it has been received by God. And then number three is that the priests are communicating that then they are now forgiven. Again, you go back and you look at what the priest is doing in that sacrifice and what's happening, and it's the picture that God has forgiven them. So, the priest represents God to man. He provides access to the Lord. He assures the people of God's acceptance of them, and he communicates God's forgiveness to them. Any questions about Leviticus 6 or about this aspect? Okay, well, let's take a look at the other half of the equation. The priest represents man to Yahweh. Well, that we see in chapter 7. Because in chapter 7, we see that the priests take on the burdens of the people. And we talked about when the burnt offering, and you guys pointed out, a very important aspect of the sacrifice of the burnt offering is what would the people do with the animal? Before they killed it, what did they do? They put their hands on it. Thank you. And so by so doing, by consciously, clearly putting your hands on the animal, the people were identifying with the animal. Now, they left it at the entrance to the tent of meeting. It was then up to the priests to take that burden, whether it's a burnt offering, sin offering, grain offering, whatever it was, the priests then took that to the altar. And you see this emphasis of the priests taking on the burden of the people. Since I would not be able to go to the altar and offer my sacrifice, I have to trust that if Steve is a priest, when Steve is going to the altar, my needs, my desires, my sin is being appropriately taken. Well, that only works if Steve is taking on my burden. But as a priest, he is taking on my burden. So even though I cannot offer the sacrifice, he is offering that sacrifice in my place. And so you'll notice each one of those sacrifices is described as being given to the priest so that the priest can then take it to the Lord. The second thing you'll see in chapter 7 is this idea that in so doing, the priest just doesn't passively bring the animal and either cut it up or do anything, put it on it. There is the process by which the priest vocalizes and verbalizes the needs that the priest is bringing. So the priest takes on the burden. The priest then goes to the altar and presents that burden on behalf of the person. And then he trusts / allows Yahweh to provide. Okay, because if you go through, we talked about it. Do the priests have their own land? Okay. Were the priests allowed to farm and garden? Not much. So how were the priests taken care of? Right. The priests had to trust God to provide for them. Every single day, the priests were trusting / allowing God to provide for them. And that's what it's talking about. That's why within the sacrifices, some of it is set aside for the priests to be able to eat, because they weren't allowed to keep their own flocks. They weren't allowed to have their large farms. Dave, you look like you're ready to ask a question. Were you just breathing again? Okay, so that's Leviticus 6 and 7. So now we come to Leviticus chapters 8 and 9. Yes?
Before you go, what's this business about a person ate blood or something that was cut off from the people?
So blood was really, really important. We find out later in Leviticus that the life is in the blood. So what was symbolic in animal blood, which was true in Jesus's blood, was that was the key. And so as a result, the people were not allowed to eat the blood. Now you may think, well, gee, why did you need a law for that? I don't need to be told not to eat dirt. Okay, why make a law of that? Well, the reason is because in many cultures, eating blood was a very symbolic or ritualistic aspect of obtaining the strength, obtaining the favor of that which you eat. So culturally, all around them, everybody ate the blood. And so the Israelites need to be told, no, you don't eat the blood, and here is why. Does that answer your question?
But if they're cut off from the people, are they cast out of the camp or just?
Oh, so your question, so to be cut off from the people, it does mean to be excluded from community fellowship. Sometime that meant actually leaving the camp. Sometime it meant that they were shunned, and not being able to participate in the covenant community is huge. Now we're going to find out later in Leviticus, there are ways to then be brought back to the people. So you can be restored to covenant fellowship. But that's what it meant to be cut off. It was to be outside of the covenant community.
So much in these chapters just seems so harsh to us modern day believers.
Right. We'll talk more about being cut off in the future, because I do want to take the time and we'll show you the New Testament equivalent of that. Other questions? Okay, so now we come to Leviticus chapter 8 and 9. You remember when we talked about, in our introductory to Leviticus, we talked about the fact that Leviticus has a lot of laws in it, but there's also narrative. So in Leviticus chapters 8 and 9, we're back to a narrative. Moses is describing a series of events. So this is an action. This is, if you were watching a movie, the action would pick up again. What's happening in chapters 8 and 9? Okay. Yes, it is the ordination ceremony. It is the ordination process for Aaron and his sons. So these are the high priests and his sons. And so that's what you see. This is an action. You're going to see the actual ordination process, the setting aside of the high priests. Again, creation, fall, redemption, glory. God is holy, we were holy. Because of sin, we've fallen. Now God is beginning to redeem us. So he's beginning the process of sacrifice. Well, now he's going to initiate the process of the sacrificers. It's all part of the big picture. Now, what's the first thing that he does in order to begin this ordination process? Okay, worship, washing. Look at verses 1 through 3 of chapter 8. Okay, so he's going to assemble the congregation. Now, you need to see the picture that's going on here, because it's very deliberate. You've got the entire congregation assembling. Where are they assembling? At the tent of meeting. So at the tent of meeting, who's there? God. Remember, God's glory filled the tabernacle. The pillar of fire by day, the cloud by night. Other way around. Pillar of fire at night. Bottom line is God's glory is there. The people are there. Now, what's interesting is, again, between the Holy of Holies, between the tabernacle, you had the large tent. And what was in that open space? Nothing. There were no people there. You had an altar, you had a lampstand, but you had God, you had the people, And then you visually had this very large gap between the two. So God is using architecture to make very clear the reality of the separation between a holy God and a sinful congregation. He is deliberately showing the people why they need a priest, why they need a sacrifice. So you have God in the Holy of Holies, you've got all the people, you've got all this empty space. Now, who enters the empty space? Moses, Aaron, and his sons. And so now you have this picture. Into this empty space, you have people who can cross that boundary. You have people who can now take the needs of the people to God. You have people who can cross that space and represent God to the people. So what is happening visually in space-time, in the middle of the desert, using space, canvas, and these other word and visual pictures, is a clear explanation of the holiness of God, the sinfulness of man, and the absolute necessity of a mediator. Now, within that situation, now within this empty space that people can now see, what does God do through Moses? Not a trick question. He guides them. What else?
Moses was the one who actually put the clothing and the cleansing. He washed Aaron's sons, put the clothing and the tunics, the ephod and everything on Aaron. So
he's consecrating them. He's giving them special clothes. He's washing them. He's putting blood on a lot of different things. And I'm going to come back to the details in just a second. But in the bigger picture, as Steve said, he is consecrating them. He is ordaining them. In other words, he's placing the very authority of God on these priests to do what it is they're supposed to do. That's what ordination means. Ordination means to be granted a delegated authority from God. So the people were not making this up. Unlike other religions, the people were not saying, okay, how do we get to God? Well, we're going to identify these people, and these are the sacrifices we're going to do, and we're going to hope that this works. No, this is God setting it up, God ordaining it, God stating this is what is going to happen. And in order to let you know that this is what is going to happen, from my idea, these are the specific things you are going to do. Number one, they needed a sacrifice. Okay, because the priests are just as sinful as the people. So part of the ordination service is a sacrifice for the sin of the priests. Next part of the ordination service, there's a lot of talk about clothing. Why? It set them apart. Okay? Let me ask you a question. Why do militaries have uniforms? Okay? Why do certain schools have uniforms? Okay? It sets them apart. It allows them all to be similar. So my point being is clothing matters. God spent a lot of time in Scripture talking about what to wear because clothing communicates. Oh, it would be a TV show. God cares what you wear. Does he care today? Or did that go out with the Old Testament? I'll give you a hint. God still cares what we wear. Now, we'll talk about that more for a minute, but again, I just wanted to begin to show you these links between, oh, well, Leviticus chapters 8 and 9 just talk about what you're supposed to wear. Well, that doesn't apply to us. Well, I may not have on a breastplate, I may not carry the and the Thummim with me, but what I wear still matters to God. And all we have to do is recognize that even today, there are uniforms. There are certain things you are supposed to wear that reminds us, oh yeah, what we wear matters. So after the washing, after the sacrifices, after clothing them, then what happens? At the very end of chapter, I think it's the end of chapter 8. Not yet. For 7 days they are set apart. They are dedicated, they are set apart, they are sanctified. So they do this ritual and they are set apart. Now, Patty Lynn was asking a question throughout this week, and it's a good question. You notice there's a whole lot of blood that goes on their ear, their thumb, their right toe. They put blood on their clothing. What happens to all that blood? Well, there were holy laundromats inside the tent of meeting. Actually, we don't know. It's one of those things where you look at it and it's just not clear. How often did they wash it? Did they have special stain removers to get rid of all that blood? Was there hydrogen peroxide? You know what? It's in there. We just don't know. But there is a lot of blood involved. There is a lot of blood on the clothing here that somehow that's not an issue for them. So you come to the end of chapter 8, and then now what happens in chapter 9? They eat. There's a feast. They're going to eat up all the meat. And who eats it? And the people. So again, you have this communal meal that is a picture of God accepting Aaron and his sons. So remember, everything that we were talking about in theory, on paper, in chapters 1 through 7, the people are now seeing played out in real life. They now can see that Aaron and his sons will be accepted as their representative. The people can now see that Aaron and his sons have the authority to speak on behalf of God. So that which was theory is now played out in real life. So again, there's some pretty good narrative in Leviticus. And now we get to a really interesting narrative in Leviticus, because what happens in chapter 10? Yeah, the story of Nadab and Abihu. What happens? Yeah. Oopsie. Okay, there we go. Oh, my battery may be dying. Okay, if my battery dies, I'll just speak more loudly. So Nadab and Abihu, it says they offered strange fire. Now, we don't know what that strange fire is. You can't figure it out by going back into the Hebrew and say, oh, the Hebrew means this, and they were doing something or other. We don't know what it is. Jewish commentators don't know what it is. So we don't know the specific. And I think that may actually be on purpose, because what's clear is they were not doing what God told them to do. So what does God do to them? He burns them with fire. Now again, you can see the significance of all of this that's happening. God could have just struck them dead, and they would have died, and the same thing would have been accomplished. But he didn't do that. Why do you think God used fire? Say what?
Fight fire with fire?
Fight fire with fire. Okay, they're bringing a fire, and he's got the proper fire. Good. Why else? Man-made as opposed to God-made. Why else? Obedience. But why use fire? Yes. Well, no, the bodies were still there because remember, 2 guys had to come in and take them out of the camp. Guys, what were they doing on the altar? On fire. Why? Because that fire was a symbol of what God does to sin. So for God to consume them with fire is a reminder, guys, in many ways, this should be happening to all of us. The way God consumed Nadab and Abihu with fire is actually the way we should all be consumed by sin, but aren't, because we have substitutionary sacrifices. Because God, I have no idea how you open that up. Because we have this sacrifice, because I can take my sin, place it on an animal. A priest can take that animal and put it on a sacrifice. Rather than me showing up before God and then being consumed by fire, God's wrath, God's fire is directed to the sacrifice so that now through the priest I have access to God. And again, the people could see that in the real life example of Nadab and Abihu. They worshiped God the wrong way. They offered a strange fire, whatever that was. And what's interesting is that whole episode is described basically in 2 verses. Then what happens? The rest of the chapter is cleaning up the mess. Okay, 2 of Aaron's nephews come and take Nadab and Abihu out of the camp. Okay, Aaron and 2 other sons are now told to do what? Offer a sacrifice. And then what were they supposed to do?
They weren't to mourn, do not let your hair become unkempt, do not tear your clothes, or you will die, and the Lord will be angry with the whole community.
Yeah, so Aaron and his sons are not given permission to mourn. Why? Because what Nadab and Abihu did was wrong, and God's judgment of them was proper. And because Aaron and his sons are always priests. It is always their responsibility to be acting on behalf of God and acting on behalf of men. So Aaron and his sons, they offer a sacrifice, they are cleaned, and they continue in the service of the priesthood. Questions about that?
Just seems so harsh. You know, you had said earlier that we represent God to the people. And I guess that puts a huge responsibility on us as being a royal priesthood, that even when we mess up and are pulled over for speeding or whatever, people are watching, and you still represent God. All the time.
Yes.
We don't know the time frame, of course, but it looks like this is the very next chapter after they were ordained, that some enters the state.
Well, and you're right. We don't know the time frame. The narrative continues through, so you almost get the impression that it was like the same day or soon after. We just don't know when this occurred. But it's very clear that they knew better. So we now understand the story of the priesthood in its Levitical context. So how does this apply? How does Jesus fulfill this? Again, this is an easy one. Turn, if you would, to Hebrews. In the same way that there was a whole lot in Hebrews about sacrifices and Jesus being our sacrifice, somebody read Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through 16.
Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need.
Thank you. Now, there are numerous places in Hebrew where it talks about Jesus as our high priest. And there are numerous areas in which we see Jesus fulfilling the various aspects that we saw in Leviticus. One of the first things that we can see, a priest represents God to man. How did Jesus represent God to man? Not a trick question. He's God incarnate. When the disciples said, "Show us the Father," Jesus says, "Look, you're looking at him. You want to see God? You're looking at me." He is God. So Jesus is very much representing God to us because he is God. How does he fulfill the role of a priest as an intercessor for us? Someone read Romans 8:34.
Who is the one who condemns? Christ Jesus is the one who died, yes, rather. Who was raised? Who is at the right hand of God the Father? Or who is at the right hand of God, who also intercedes for us? So
Paul is telling us that even now, Jesus is right there with God, interceding on our behalf. And again, don't miss the priestly language in Romans 8. It's there. We talked about the idea of Jesus as he's God to us, so whatever Jesus says is authoritative. We can see God, we understand that. When Jesus forgives us, we know we are forgiven. All of those aspects are proving that Jesus is our great high priest, and he's our intercessor. He was man. He was tempted like we are. He is able to go to God and effectively intercede for us because he has been one of us as man. You look at the ordination ritual, and elsewhere in Hebrews chapter 7 talks about Jesus fulfilling every aspect of that ordination, being set apart by God. Now, the interesting thing about Jesus is that Jesus did not have to offer a sacrifice for himself. And one of the points of the author of Hebrews is how this shows Jesus was the greatest high priest. Because unlike every other high priest that went before him, Jesus was sinless and therefore did not need to offer a sacrifice for himself. Therefore, all of the sacrifice that Jesus did was for us. And then in Jesus, we see proper worship. Okay, Jesus talks about this idea. Think about his time with the woman at the well. God is a spirit, and those that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And he goes on to correct and show the woman at the well what proper worship looks like. So, again, we can see Jesus as the fulfillment of Leviticus 6 through 10. And now we can ask ourselves the question, well, how do we fulfill Leviticus? How does it apply to us? And I think the first thing we can see is that we are to represent God to people. We are to make people graciously, lovingly, and mercifully aware of their sin and aware of their Savior. That is our role as priests. And it's important. 1 Peter 2:5. Somebody read that for us. Remember in Exodus, while you're turning there, in Exodus chapter 19, as they're getting ready and they're at Mount Sinai and God is ready to give them the 10 Commandments and the rest of the law, God himself says in Exodus 19:6, I will make you a royal priesthood, a chosen generation, a holy nation. Now look at what Peter says after Christ has died and been resurrected. Somebody read 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 5.
You also, as lively stones, are built up a spiritual house, and holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ.
Okay? Again, look at the priestly, look at the Levitical language that you see here in Peter, talking about sacrifice, talking about being a royal priesthood. We as his church, we as God's covenant people, have the privilege of being priests, all of us. Not just the pastor, not just the youth minister, all of us are priests. All of us have the joy of representing God to the people. We have the truths that the world desperately needs to hear. We have the relationships that the world is desperately seeking. We have the joy of being God to the world around us. Number 2, just like Jesus, we are to bring people to God. What does that look like? Well, think of what Jesus did. Jesus welcomed believers. Jesus welcomed everybody. The one thing you can say about Jesus is that other than the Pharisees, everybody felt comfortable being around him. Jesus was never accused of being legalistic, although he was the full embodiment of God. We need to bring people to God. The other thing is that just like Jesus did, just like the priests did, we should be interceding for one another. Somebody read James chapter 5, verse 6. Or if you already know it, you can just say it. James 5:6. And you'll notice it's one of the one another's of the New Testament.
You condemn a brother to watch a person who does not resist you.
James 5:6. It's supposed to be pray for one another.
It's 5:16.
Oh, 5, there's a one missing. Thank you, Karen. Please read that.
Therefore, confess your sins to one another, pray for one another that you may be healed.
Again, notice what's happening there. The confession of sin to one another, the praying for one another. That makes so much more sense, and we get a fuller picture of it when we think of the sacrifices that happened and we think of the priest's role in that. Galatians 5:13 and Galatians 6:2. Bear one another's burdens. Philippians 2. Do not consider yourselves more highly than the others, but consider others more high than yourself. To be a priest means to bear one another's burdens. To be a priest means to take on one another's burdens. To be a priest means to, I don't know, do you think priests wear masks? Do you think priests get vaccinated? Think about our response as a church to the whole COVID situation. One of the things that we anguished with the most as elders with COVID with a number of people who said, we're not coming to church if we have to wear a mask. When we had people who were upset that the elders were advocating getting a vaccine. The demographic with the highest rate of non-mask wearing and non-vaccine, white evangelical Protestants just like us. The highest group. And the number one reason when people are asked, because I don't want to. Because I am free. Because I don't have to. Because I'm not afraid of the virus. Because I might get sick. And I'll be glad to talk to anyone about the science behind it. But I find it difficult in Scripture to justify not wearing a mask or getting a vaccine on the behalf of somebody else because it might be inconvenient to us or it might actually make me sick. Just can't fathom it. We're supposed to be priests. We're supposed to be the first one saying, look, if it's good for somebody else, then I will take on that burden. I'm going to wear a mask, not because I'm afraid, not because I need it, but you might. I might protect you. And if it means I'm going to be uncomfortable for your behalf, isn't that what we signed up to do as believers? Isn't that the example that Jesus gave us? Then why is it that we are the people most shouting out, no, I don't have to do it. I don't want to do it. It's uncomfortable for all these reasons. What kind of a message are we sending? We get the privilege of representing God to the people. We get the privilege of coming alongside people and bringing them to God. How often have you had the opportunity to sit with a crying friend because of a heartache? That's a privilege. That's what we do as priests. When the person's just so weighed down, that they can't pray on their own. When they just feel like God is there, and they're down here, they feel like Mary. God gives us the strength and the joy of picking them up, sometimes literally, to bring them to God. And then lastly, like Jesus, we're to worship God properly. Worship is a privilege. Worship is a joy. But the story of Nadab and Abihu is a reminder that we don't get to do whatever we want, slap the name worship on it, and call it okay. I guarantee you that if we started temple prostitution, that would be problematic. Okay? We need to worship God properly. Now, within that, God gives us so much freedom. But there are right ways and wrong ways to worship God. There are things that he tells us to do that we should do. There are things that he tells us we should not do, and we should not do them. And within that, we have the joy of worshiping God. That's what it means to be a priest. Priests were the only people among the people who had direct access to God. Guys, we have direct access to God through Jesus because we have direct access to Jesus through Jesus. So when we think about Mary and we think about how this applies, we recognize that all the truths of Leviticus, all the truths of sacrifice, all the truths about Jesus will be totally meaningless to her unless somebody tells her. Unless somebody is living a life and saying the words in such a way that tells Mary the truths of Scripture. Mary's not going to figure it out. It's our responsibility. We get the joy of coming alongside Mary and telling her these wonderful truths of the gospel. That's why I titled this series, The Gospel of Leviticus, because Leviticus is actually good news. And we get to be the good newsists. One time I said the good nudists. It's another lesson. Somebody's got to tell Mary. Somebody has to have taken the time to have a relationship with Mary. Somebody needs to live a life in such a way that when we speak, we are believable. But we can tell Mary the good news. We can come alongside Mary and bear her burdens with her. We can go with her when she needs to talk to her husband and confess. We can go with her when she needs to deal with other people. If she needs therapy, we can go with her. We can be the therapy. We can bear Mary's burdens with her, and we can worship God with Mary. That's how Leviticus applies. Leviticus gives us a word picture. Jesus is the truth to which the word picture points. We are now the incarnation of the truth of Jesus because he is here through us. And everybody like Mary, which is everybody like us, needs to hear the truth and see the truth. And we have the joy of being God to people. We get to give God's hugs. We get to receive God's hugs. We are God to people. We are bring the people to God when they can't. And together as a community, we worship the God with whom we can now have free access because of what Jesus did on the cross on our behalf. Yes.
And priest is a 24/7, and I forgot what it's called. No, what we do and what we say shows what we wear.
Yep. Okay. Karen, would you close us in a word of prayer, please? Amen. Thank you, everybody. And please be safe out there. I don't want to have to take care of any hand injuries from fireworks.